Hello, welcome to Pensions in 10 with me, David Brooks, on my own again this week. Recording this on a Friday morning because of the bank holiday. So this will come out to you on Tuesday. But there's only really one item this week to talk about, and that is the Pensions Commission's interim report. Came out of the blue, or did for me. I'd have talked about it last week if I'd known, but I didn't know. So should have guessed because they had some data that came out on the Monday, and I talked about that a little bit, which feeds into this a little bit. But the interim report is out. It's quite weighty, 190 pages. So it'll be interesting to see where they go over the next 12 months or so till we get the full report next year. But there's quite a few areas, I think, where we can consider where pensions policy might be heading and where the thinking of the authors is currently going. I think it's worth noting that there isn't much in here that's completely new thinking to people that think about pensions policy. A lot of the data, there's quite a good understanding within policymakers around the issues, the way the labour market works and impacts pension saving, the way the gender pensions gap is created in a similar space as well. But there's still some interesting stuff in there. So I'll just go through. I'll have to refer to this every now and again, so I've got quite a few notes on this. But there's some notes here that are just some talking points, just worth just looking at. State pension is clearly seen as the foundation for pension provision in the UK. It's central across the income distribution, not just the poorest people. This does weaken the argument for means testing because that's probably unlikely to cut through and save much in cost. It does bring to head, I think, some considerations around the way pensions credit works for those who are on state pension and not a lot else, if we want them to have a better quality of life. But it is that anchor of adequacy. It is around 30% of median income. So I think if you started with a clean sheet of paper, you might think it's probably not a bad place to put the state pension. They do talk about the triple lock a couple of times. Critical of it, I think, in the main. Appreciative of what it's done to bring state pensions up to perhaps a more adequate level. I think there's going to be recommendations in the future. This is pure speculation, but I think there will be a recommendation that it moves to an earnings-based increment, maybe earnings plus something. So I think the triple lock is on its last legs, but for how long? So if this final report isn't until next year, we'll have another triple lock in 2027, and then there's got to be legislative change. So who knows? But I think it's on it. It's nearer the end than the beginning. I think that's probably true. There's a subtle shift in there around looking at people's needs and adequacy around pensions and looking at it from a household perspective. I think there's an expectation or an understanding that people see their lives as a shared lifetime income, not just an individual. This does mean, so some low earners, you could say, in inverted commas, may not be in a low earning household because they may have one partner that's earning more, have a large pension, and one person earning less having a smaller pension, whether that needs to be considered together and around a little more when considering outcomes and adequacy. Are we thinking around a system that's looking at the individual, whereas we have in reality where people are living in households, and so are thinking a bit more on the round. So I'm not sure if that's probably a novel area to look at, and policymakers might be thinking about that in the future. In private pensions world, workplace pension schemes and things like that, I don't think we're going to see any big changes. I think it's all about trying to increase contributions rather than getting new people in, perhaps, but just getting people saving. So I think there's going to be incremental increases to contributions. There is an acceptance that even if you're a high earner, but on the minimum auto enrollment contributions, that probably isn't enough for you to have that income replacement rate that you'd be expecting. So, but looking into the ways to make that work better. Surprisingly little in there around the more nuanced, interesting ways, sidecar and alternative models for saving. There's not much mention of CDC in there, for instance. But yeah, notable that's probably a direction of travel again. But again, this isn't anything brand new. There's definitely an inference that for people, workers these days, there aren't that many levers that you can do. And I think for most people, the system effectively expects people to work longer and retire later. I think that's almost a given. So given the level of contributions going to DC schemes and given the longevity challenge as well. So, but I think that does predicate on people being able to work for longer, jobs exist, people's health enables them to do that. And that kind of feeds into some of the pensions adequacy problems. So that labour market, as I say, exacerbates the gender pensions gap that's there for low earners. But also there's this silo problem of, we're looking at pensions wealth, but it's predicated on so many different things. Adequacy will depend on health, housing, your care, what tax you're going to be paying. And as these move, the pensions outcome will change, and people will move around these throughout their working lives. So this future reform has to be able to accept that this system is broadly fixed, and people will be moving through it inefficiently and inefficiently. And I think that's definitely an area that they'll be expecting to have a bit of trying to get that nuance into the system, whereas at the moment it seems to be heavily sort of bolstered onto the labour market. So pensions income derives how much money that goes in. Is that right? Is that fair? Does that bake in inequality? I think that's something that's going to come through in conversations over the next 12, 18 months. There is some reference in there to the tax relief system, which is skewed towards higher earners, and that's been discussed ad nauseum within the industry. But I think it's notable it's in here, and it's something that perhaps there'll be influence to move that into a flat rate or something else to try to smooth out some of the inequalities in the system. Decumulation comes into focus as something that the authors don't like the way the freedoms has been introduced. They are worried about people harming themselves by the decisions they make. And I think this is a debate that goes throughout the industry. I'm probably more on the don't like freedoms so much group, but I know I'm probably in a minority, in honesty. I think the industry quite likes the freedoms, and there's evidence out there that people are making good decisions. So the majority of the small lump sums that are taken are from the smaller end. You don't see people very often taking £100,000 as a one-off cash lump sum and all the tax implications that would have. But still, there is that issue with people wanting stable, predictable income versus a system that seems to be focusing on the flexibilities in the system rather than trying to help people manage that risk. I mean, who is carrying that risk? Ultimately, members are now carrying the risk of their future incomes, and is that a problem? And I think it is. What does this mean for employers? Well, I think employers are going to have to brace themselves for recommendations and then legislation, which will. I mean, this isn't going to be immediate, but it's something for the next maybe 5-10 years. The contributions are expected to go up. I think minimum contributions are going to go up in some way. I think that's probably the key thing. And people will be working longer and retiring later. And I think that's a fact that employers and trustees will need to get DC schemes will have to get used to. I think having people going at 60, 65 is going to be a thing of the past, especially as you have, this is not necessarily in the report, but we have a cohort of people, we're still basing our evidence on a cohort of people that would have had some DB, state pension, and then a bit of DC on top. As we move through time, the DB pots, the DB pensions are going to be getting smaller, and we're going to have more people just going on DC, and that is going to be far harder for them to retire early. They might have a DB scheme that with a retirement age of 60, 65, and then some DC funds, and they can then flex that around the DB, either taking the DC early to bridge to when the DB kicks in, or having that regular income and then using the DC pot in cashing it all to do something fun or do something that they need to do to clear debts and make their lives into retirement more comfortable. But we're going to have people with just DC, and I think that's going to be a big challenge coming through. So there isn't much in there that's new, as I say, but it's definitely going towards a gradual ratcheting, but not big reform, but definitely movement around contributions, retirement timing, tax relief. I think these are going to be big things. So we should note again, this is only an interim report. There's going to be a lot more perhaps in the next full report and with recommendations or everything else. But I think there's a direction of travel that we can see. And I think that there is a challenge, there is a tension between what's happening in the labour market and what's happening and how that feeds through into the pensions system and how those two things work together. I think there's a potential in here. Now, I'm hopeful, there is a potential for some blue sky thinking, esoteric solutions that could, real bold solutions that could change the system for the better, especially for people at the low median income end. And I would hope that comes through a little bit more in the next report, and something, whether it is adaptation and changes to the state system to try to equalise outcomes a little more for people. And there isn't so much in here about the people that aren't saving as well. I think I would like to have seen a bit more in here about how, what do we do for those people? Do we just leave pensions for them as a non-starter, or do we lower all the thresholds as the 2017 Auto Enrolment Review recommended and get as many people as we can into pensions? I still think there's a bit lacking around what do we really want to do about those people. The 10 million or so people that aren't in a pension but are working but not defined as a worker. What are they doing about their later life? Are they just going to have state pension? If they are, then are we happy that that's all they're going to get? And if so, what do we do to help them in the intervening period? Anyway, I think that's enough on the Pensions Commission interim report. I hope you all had a very nice bank holiday weekend. I'm looking forward to it. This is weird when you record things and it doesn't come out until after, but it's looking like it's going to be a sunny one. So hopefully you've all had a nice barbecue and not too pink this Tuesday morning. Thank you.